Today, we want to discuss how life in the city differs from life in the countryside, in the village. How does city life affect human life and urban society?
This is a big theme. The main thing is that it's historically long. Let's not go into the details of what happened before the global catastrophe 13,000 years ago, but what happened after the dust settled. The smoke cleared away, and everything took, more or less, at least from the point of view of geography, the form that is familiar to us. If we want to understand something, we must consider this question in historical development. Well, in relation to the formation of civilization, it turns out that the landscape in which ethnogenesis occurs, it also dictates the economic order. That is, if the productivity of biocenosis is sufficient, it is possible to live in a settled way. If the productivity of biocenosis is insufficient, then a settled life becomes impossible, and, accordingly, a nomadic family way of life is obtained. A steppe, a desert zone, where deserts are inhabited, it turns out that a nomadic family way of life initially dominated there. And forests and mountains dictated a sedentary lifestyle and the return on the economy and the level of social protection of the individual and everyone as a whole was ensured with a compact communal way of living. These were the starting conditions. With a nomadic lifestyle, many crafts become almost impossible. For example, metallurgy and everything connected with it, pottery and everything connected with it. If the clay is slightly not the right one, then that's it. Again, in order to bake clay, engage in metallurgy, you need an energy supply capacity, which is difficult to achieve in the steppe or in the desert. There are no primary energy carriers such as firewood, coal, and something else. These are the starting conditions for today's civilization. And with a sedentary lifestyle, as one of the historians noted, the smallest improvement in agriculture had a much greater impact on subsequent history than many wars, than many political intrigues, because it turns out that productivity in terms of food and fodder for livestock, that biocenoses of the steppe and desert zones are insufficient. In general, the family somehow feeds itself. But if there is crop production, then the productivity of crop production, with proper governance towards the economy, is enough to feed not only those who are engaged in agriculture, but also those who are not engaged in agriculture and can engage in some other types of activities. Therefore, a sedentary lifestyle in those areas where biocenoses allow the development of crop production and to feed many other people who are not engaged in agriculture, it is precisely the generator of the development of crafts, then industry. Accordingly, when a product appears that is different from a product that a person produces himself, then this is the reason for the emergence of trade. Well, cities initially arise precisely as trade and craft centers, specializing precisely in trade and crafts. Further, civilization develops, the economy develops, crafts develop, agriculture also develops and slowly becomes able to feed an increasing number of the population outside of agriculture. Cities gain stability and become not only trade and craft centers, but also centers of culture. Moreover, culture precisely in the all people's meaning, since such social institutions as the family generate all other social institutions, and among these social institutions, science and the system of education carried out on a professional basis. This also became the property of cities, by force of the peculiarities of those types of activity and the circumstance that agriculture can feed them all. The second question is connected with the fact that, nevertheless, if a society lives with non-human types of psyche structure, then the birth rate is excessive in relation to the capacity of the ecological niche. And Malthus, looking at what is happening, was not much mistaken when he said that the population can grow exponentially, and the possibilities of production grow much more slowly, by virtue of which there is always a certain deficit of production capacity in relation to demands. And this excess birth rate was also characteristic of rural areas, and the progress of agriculture was accompanied by the fact that some of the excess population from the countryside flowed to the cities. Economists like to speculate on the theme that labor migration of this kind contributed to the development of the economy, politics, and so on and so forth. What is left out of consideration? And out of consideration remained the circumstance that the city, as such, is an anti-biological factor. That is, the urban environment works against a person, and if you rummage through the archives of European countries that have survived there since the Middle Ages, then it turns out that a new surname appears in their city, someone came to live. Then the surname exists for several centuries, and then it disappears. The city continues to exist. This happens because truly an urban environment is an anti-human factor. In 1944, a group of the future academician, Soviet geneticist Dubinin, conducted a study of the fruit fly Drosophila in Voronezh. Voronezh had only just been liberated from occupation. There was nothing but carriageways and broken ruins. Industry was not working, the transport had only just started up. And the research showed that the fruit fly is genetically identical to rural populations. In 1946, the research was repeated, and it showed that the Drosophila fly had mutated. In the 50s, his same group was engaged in the analysis of the impact of weapons of mass destruction and the development of means of protection. And then it turned out that the chromosomal apparatus of the higher primates, on which these experiments were carried out, is 40 to 50 times more sensitive than the chromosomal apparatus of the fruit fly Drosophila, with which the geneticists tinker. These results were obtained in the late 1940s, early 1950s. And already then, they had to make politicians ponder on the theme of what lifestyle to form in the country so that children are born healthy, so that adults remain healthy throughout their whole lives, and the cost of medicine could be saved on for the simple reason that everyone is healthy and medical services are not in demand to the extent that they are in demand now. But we live in a time when politicians consider themselves entitled not to ponder on biology and not to know biology. But if this can be partially forgiven of the politicians of the 30s and 40s, because they simply solved the task to be for the population of the Soviet Union or not to be, because the General Plan Ost simply assumed the destruction of most of those living on the territory of the Soviet Union. What General Plan Ost did not envision, the Japanese also had far-reaching plans for what to do with Siberia. Therefore, there are no special complaints about those politicians, given that they were able to solve the most pressing problems of their era. But there are a lot of questions to subsequent politicians on this theme, because yes, a person can live for months in a submarine with cockroaches. Persuading a cat to live in a submarine, this is already a big problem. Rats do not live on every submarine, and a person can live with cockroaches. But to say that this is the optimal environment for humans would be wrong. Because besides the fact that we are a social species, we are, after all, a part of biocenosis. And if we do not communicate with biocenosis, we change, and change far from the better. As in the aspect of bodily health, so in the aspect of what is happening in our psyche. And if you understand all this, then the main factor that has been connected with the interrelationship of the city and the village throughout the history of civilization, it is not at all that labor migration ensured the development of culture. It is completely different.
Трудовая миграция обеспечивала развитие культуры. Он совсем в другом.
The influx of fresh, healthy genes from rural areas was the biological basis so that the development of urban culture was in principle possible. Because if it were not for this influx of fresh genes, then the population of cities would simply biologically degrade and die out. And if you look at the statistics of the distribution of the population in cities and in rural areas, then we now have 1/3 of the population living in rural areas and in small towns. And in Europe, in developed countries, about 90-odd% of the population is residents of cities, large and not very large. And if we talk about European biocenoses, then there are few areas of natural biocenoses left, because they cut down their forests either for firewood or for the construction of ships, when there was the era of wooden shipbuilding, and the vacated territories were settled.
Пока была эпоха деревянного судостроения. И освободившиеся территории были заселены.
And again, if we talk about how many of the European states lived, then at the end of the 19th century, England could exist on its islands autonomously for only 2 weeks. All other well-being was provided by the delivery of something from abroad. One of the English folk wisdoms at that time said that the well-being of England is ensured by the fleet and the providence of God, which protects both. If you look at how Russia lived, then Russia lived qualitatively differently, because even up to the present time, after two industrial revolutions, the first of the era of Peter I and the second, the 1930s, we preserved, well, perhaps 80% of the territory in which the biocenoses developed in a natural way and which civilization could not irreversibly cripple, although there biocenoses also got it. And this, connected with biology, this is the main thing, proceeding from which we should evaluate the modern urban and rural way of life. Moreover, in the era after the first bourgeois revolutions, when the breakdown of the strata caste system eliminated the restriction on the consumption of these or those goods and opened wide gates for the race of consumption, the city changed its quality. If in the era before wild capitalism, the city was still the center of culture, first of all, the center of science, the center of education, precisely of all national significance, and then already being the center of trade and crafts. Then, after the breakdown of the strata caste system, the city began to develop according to the principle of maximum profit from 1 square kilometer of territory.
In Moscow, in my opinion, everything is already calculated in centimeters.
Maybe even from a meter, but all the same, at least a square kilometer is needed in order for there to be some kind of quantum of the way of life in which it fits. But within the boundaries of this square kilometer, all sorts of micro effects are already beginning, where maybe it even comes down to the struggle for millimeters. If we consider the way of life, starting from biology, then we get the following picture. If an individual sees a lot of unfamiliar faces during the day, when this multitude exceeds a certain threshold number, then he translates a signal to the planet's noosphere that the ecological niche in this region is overcrowded.
В ноосферу планеты сигнал о том, что экологическая ниша в этом регионе переполнена.
The noosphere regulates the life of biocenoses, and accordingly, if there is a massive flow of signals that the ecological niche is overcrowded, then the pan-biospheric mechanisms for regulating the number of the biological species of the corresponding population are activated. How are they activated? First of all, diseases are activated. Then the mechanism of blocking reproductive abilities is activated. Accordingly, men and women cannot fulfill the functions of the successors of the clan. The statistics of all kinds of diseases connected with the impossibility to procreate are higher in cities. Further, suicide statistics are also higher in cities. The next factor, Factually, a city with megalopolis development, with high-rise buildings, it destroys the family way of life. And, moreover, it destroys the communal way of life. Therefore, the children turn out to be nobodies. If, for example, in the village, a neighbor could watch, and if someone got up to mischief, then tell the parents or spank the child herself without any objections from the parents. And if the children complained to the parents, then the parents could add an additional beating. In the city, no one's children for whom no one is responsible. Further, if parents in school do not cope with upbringing, then, reaching adolescence, there is no meaning of life, no will, no совесть, instincts of herd pack behavior, and criminality. That is, purely biologically, criminality in a megalopolis is ineradicable for the simple reason that criminality is a cultural shell of intraspecific competition for a better place in the sun and the destruction of ecological niches that are redundant in relation to capacity. If the question arose about the capacity of the ecological niche, we were faced with such circumstances that, in the legal department of the Council of the Russian Federation, they do not know what the capacity of the ecological niche is, and ask questions on the theme of how to express it somehow in common language. To this we can say that this is an extreme incompetence. Because, after all, the juridical basis of society must correlate with all 6 categories of objective laws to which the life of human society is subordinated. That is pan-biospheric, species-specific, ethical, religious, noospheric, socio-cultural, which are a continuation of ethical, further, economic and governorial. In general, it is necessary to study, comrades politicians and statesmen. Otherwise, you are worthless. This is all that concerns the impact of the urban environment on the individual and on the biology of the population living in the city. In general, similar studies in the West were turned to somewhere in the 90s. I mean the analogy with the studies of Dubin. Well, their results were confirmed in the sense that a week of work in the foundry is quite enough for the organism to react to this matter with mutations. Since the time of Dubinin, technogenic pressure on a person has increased many times over. At that time, there were no chemical fabrics. Statistics show linen and synthetic underwear, and then statistics of oncology. Household chemicals in those times, laundry soap, and, in the best case, perfume, lily of the valley or red carnation. Now this is full to the brim. Structural elements of houses of that era were mainly wood and paper wallpaper based on paste glued to the walls. Now, linoleum, synthetics, furniture is full of something that decomposes with the release of formaldehyde and so on and so forth. If we talk about various kinds of technogenic emissions, in those days, the noisiest thing, and even then not in every home, this was a sewing machine that was turned by hand or with a pedal, and with electricity in 2 wires to a light bulb. And now, a television set, a tape recorder, a whole bunch of household appliances. There is a great deal of electromagnetic radiation. Now there are even mobile phones in everyone's pockets, which radiates who knows what and also radiates who knows how.
Wi-Fi in almost every apartment.
Wi-Fi in every apartment. And since the apartments are not isolated from Wi-Fi, then if you turn on the computer, you can find 5-6 Wi-Fis at once to which you can connect. They all radiate. The only question is, do you have the password only for your Wi-Fi or for neighboring Wi-Fi too? That is, the city has become more murderous precisely as an environment for a person. Now let's look at the character of the development of many cities. Well, Mother Catherine the Great, in the old days, personally approved the plans for development of provincial cities. What was there? Well, several retail spaces, a complex of administrative buildings, mainly manor buildings. The width of the streets is such that 3 carts could pass each other. The 60s come. Has anyone been involved in the creation of master plans for the development of these cities? No one. And in those neighborhoods that were there, first they shoved 5-story Khrushchyovkas, and before that, there was only a manor building with a plot area of about 20 acres. Well, and a house somewhere over 100 square meters. This is a typical development of these provincial towns. After that, more people live in one Khrushchevka than used to live in the whole quarter. How many houses are there? Since the 1970s, Vaz has been producing at least 500,000 cars a year. 500,000. These are those starting capacities under which it was originally designed. Besides Vaz, there are a whole bunch of factories. Has anyone thought about where they will all stand and drive? Nobody was involved in infrastructures. If at the end of the 19th century, futurologists were worried about the question that megalopolises of the future would be littered with horse manure, and it was impossible to export it, then the horse manure was gone, but the chemical composition of the atmosphere of the city began to be very different from that in nature, in natural conditions. Well, and further the question related to high-rise buildings. In the 70s, statistics were revealed which read, the higher after the second or third floor, the more diseases. Moreover, not by some percentage there, but a few times, including psychic illness and including statistics of suicides. Because those who live up to about the third floor, they rarely want to commit suicide on their own. But those who live from the fifth and above, the statistics of suicides there, for some reason, are higher than at the level of the lower floors. Well, if you really go into history, an interesting thing becomes clear. While people lived on the first floor in huts and izbas, while people lived in yurts, then in different regions of the planet, the height of the human houses from the ground level was different, but each region had its own. When biologists began to study the question, it turned out that the Earth carries a certain field, and the height of the house is such as to get the maximum of this field. This is typical for yurts, which were set up by nomads in the steppe zone, and for the arrangement of izbas in central Russia. In the steppe it is somewhat lower, in the forest zone it is somewhat higher. The urban development itself is defective, both in the aspect of distribution of the city's area between residential buildings, all sorts of social facilities, ranging from shops to recreation areas, rest homes, cultural centers, and the construction of those buildings that are built in cities. Because if you nevertheless insist that the city should be built up with high-rise buildings, then, in order for a person to live normally, each apartment should not just have an area many times larger than now. It should also have a cubic capacity such that a garden would fit in it. Accordingly, the architecture should also be different. But this contradicts that lifestyle of the city, which took shape in an era when money rules everything, and the city developed according to the principle maximum profit per square kilometer. Therefore, urban civilization does not bring anything good, either to those countries that have overtaken Russia in this, or to Russia if it develops along the so-called generally accepted civilizational path, the leader of which is the West. How do politicians understand this business? Before Nabiullina sat down at the central bank and began to sabotage them, she headed the Ministry of Economic Development, and she spoke at the Moscow Urban Forum in December 2010 or 2011. There it was said that a fair share of the world's gross product is created in several dozen large cities. In Russia, it is the same. Maintaining small towns, single industry towns, is a drop in economic growth rates by 1 to 2%. Since large cities are the main creators of the gross national product, then a dozen urban agglomerations need to attract most of the country's population. And this is despite the fact that cities have a lot of problems, ranging from ecology to infrastructures, lack of housing, and so on and so forth. But factually, the head of the Ministry of Economic Development announced a program for the implementation of the biological and economic genocide of the country's population. There were no objections. Well, if you live normally, living normally is in harmony of civilization with nature, then you need to live in settlements, from which you can go out into nature on foot in half an hour, a maximum half an hour.
Пешком? Пешком. Максимум за полчаса.
Naturally, the population density in a settlement should be such that it does not give out into the biosphere a signal of overcrowdedness of ecological niche. In Soviet times, it was believed that a city with a population of more than 300,000 people had no right to exist. This conclusion was made by Estonian architects who studied this question in complex. And they believed that for an industrially developed country, cities with a population ranging from hundreds of thousands to 300,000 people allow both to provide the high quality of life of the population and to successfully develop industry, science, system of education. One can agree with them, because with the right construction, a city with a population of 100,000, which is within half an hour's walk to nature, fits into this requirement. Well, if there are roads that lead directly to the forest so that people can rest, then many things are easier. If we talk about megalopolises such as Moscow, St. Petersburg, then in them, in principle, a biologically healthy population cannot reproduce. With the density that is, it is impossible to reproduce the culturally consistent population of those who were born even with some kind of health defects. So the new development areas. High-rise buildings are poked around by strength of the fact that city transport was suppressed back in the times of Sobchak. Everyone has cars, not because they are passionate car enthusiasts. They would be happy to get rid of them. But with that public transport system, it is impossible to get rid of them. The competition for parking space comes to shooting. That is, this is already an indicator that there is nowhere to go further. This is a dead end. Accordingly, if we talk about cities such as Moscow, Leningrad, we need to deal with their territories on the theme of what are monuments of culture and architecture, and then we need to carry out a complex program of depopulation of these cities with the demolition of entire neighborhoods, with the preservation of architectural monuments, and the creation of landscapes according to which natural biocenoses can enter the city. And the city over time could really become a center of science, education, culture, and some industry. But at the same time, it would provide a much lower population density than now, a higher quality of life on account of the fact that a person would not live in an artificial environment, but would have the opportunity to communicate with nature for everyone, both on the way to work and simply during rest. If we talk about the economy, then if the economy is subordinated to the task of satisfying the real vital needs of people and not a race for profits of privateers, then there is no need for a 5-day working week, no need for people to work overtime, but at that level of development of technologies and the corresponding governance towards the economy, entirely enough will be a 4 to 5 hour working day, about which Joseph Vissarionovich Stalin wrote back in 1952. But somehow they did not heed this. If the economy is again built on the principle that it should satisfy the real needs of people, and not to work for the profit of a privateer, And a privateer entrepreneur should be in the system, like a hamster in a wheel that runs all the time but does not get anywhere. The objectives are not achieved. Then a lot of industrial production can be pilfered to small towns, settlements, villages, in which it is possible to ensure a high quality of life for the population, high health indicators in the process of reproduction of generations. Well, if we rebuild the system of education from the disgrace that the liberals have made to date into a normal system of education which is built not on textual bookish basis, but on a sensory intuitive basis, then in general only a certain number of industrial giants will remain, which, by virtue of features of technology and their functions, cannot be small, but require large technological installations and a large number of personnel for their service. But in general, there are just one or two such industries. Everything else can be disassembled into functionally independent modules, and these modules can be placed in small settlements.
И эти модули можно разместить в малых населенных пунктах.
In general, at one time, before the Great Depression, Ford built his automobile empire approximately on such a principle, that is, an assembly plant in Detroit, and a lot of all kinds of workshops that produce some kind of components around Detroit or somewhere on the outskirts. Further, a regular route around these industries, the delivery there of what they need for work, and the collection of finished products for transfer to the Detroit conveyor. This worked very well in the financial climate that was in the United States before the year 1929. Then it became impossible. Well, if you do not sacrifice the country to liberal market idiocy, then nothing prevents you from building an economy precisely oriented on the satisfaction of social needs, changing the way of life of civilization as a whole. Well, then you can live in small towns, villages, settlements, in homestead-type houses in which a family of several generations will not be cramped, where children will have the opportunity to watch dandelions grow and ladybugs crawl over them. Then children will grow up with the correct psyche. The lifestyle of the adult society will also change. That is in general all that can be said.
You said that housing is decreasing. More and more people fit into one space because they want to make a profit. But on the other hand, the transition from Stalinkas with high ceilings, large rooms, to Khrushchevkas of a smaller size, it also happened under socialism.
But it happened after the beginning of the coup d'etat, the beginning of which was laid by the assassination of Stalin, and which ended in 1993 with the establishment of the current constitution. Therefore, if we talk about what happened in the time of Stalin and what happened in the era after Stalin, then these are completely different politics, including demographic politics. Firstly, if you look at how the cities were built up with Stalinkas, firstly, there were large courtyards where there were a lot of all kinds of plantings. Within the boundaries of the house and the entrance, everyone knew each other because in the courtyards people communicated with each other and maintained the courtyard in general themselves in a condition suitable for games and everything else. Then there is a change in building standards and Khrushchevkas appear. The main quality of the Khrushchyovka is that a large family does not fit into it. Yes, we can say that in the era of the Stalinkas, there were communal apartments. But the Stalinist strategy took into account the development of the USSR economy on the basis of high science and technology. That is, these communal apartments were supposed to be resettled over time. And in the country there was supposed to be built up housing in which normal people do not live crampedly and not unpleasantly. But what happened next? This is a different theme.
Then it turns out that economic conditions are created on purpose, in order to create and drive people to cities. That is, it is a kind of mechanism for the destruction of the population.
Yes, this is a mechanism for the destruction of the population. Moreover, the term urban genocide was not invented by me. It was some Austrian architect in the 60s. That is, the problem was understood even then.
Maybe that's why it was already then proposed in Siberia to take 1 hectare of land.
In general, yes, but this is not only a question of a hectare of land. The question is that the central bank should not do what it does. The question is that the Ministry of Economic Development and Trade should be engaged in a completely different matter, and much more. This is the question of how statehood is organized, how it is reproduced, and for what objectives it works. And we now have, in general, a split between society and statehood.
But still, people have a choice. If you want to live beautifully, go and die in Moscow or in St. Petersburg. If you want to live normally, go to the Far East, take a hectare of land.
Yes, the only thing is that the problems of a normal life are not solved on one's own hectare. And in order, on this hectare, to be able to live well and happily in the continuity of generations, a correct state is needed, which will protect the entire totality of these hectares.
Yes, there is no need to go to the Far East. In central Russia, so much space has now become vacant. Tellingly, there are republics such as Tatarstan, Mariel. There, when you come along the road, you see how much better people live in the countryside. This is simply evident from the quality of the houses, from the well-keptness of these plots. And the middle zone of Russia. It is not so in the middle zone of Russia. There is a large village where, apparently, people have gathered from nearby villages, and nearby villages are already dead. And every year this is more and more visible. To what extent is some part of the gross domestic product produced in modern Russian cities? After all, the majority of the population is in Moscow. For example, there is very little production left there. There still remains from Soviet times, but so little. Its number has simply dropped significantly.
With the gross domestic product, the situation is like this. How to count? The European Union decided that it's necessary to take into account prostitution and drugs in the gross national product. Greece's gross national product rose immediately by 2%.
We do not seem to count this yet.
We don't count it, but the indicators still have the following objective. These are the volume of freight traffic. The real sector cannot work without cargo transportation. And the volume of consumption of electricity in industry, agriculture, and transport. If the economy grows, then these volumes grow. If the denominations grow, the volume of freight traffic falls. The volume of consumption of electricity in the industry and agriculture falls. Then the real sector degrades. despite all the intricacies of accounting, which shows nominal growth.
But this is some kind of strange way of destroying humanity. It is much easier to release a new virus, start a war.
The question is not in that. The question is in reliability.
Ah, that is, after a war, they will be born again.
After the war, they will be born again. Here is a question of a different kind. Here, the question consists in the liquidation of those who carry the liberal market culture and the ideology that reproduces it. The West is paying the price for not wanting to become Marxists. In general, the Marxist project was aimed at stopping the race of meaningless consumption and grinding of resources on a global scale. They didn't want to be Marxists. It was not managed to stop the consumption race by socio-cultural means. Therefore, they started the processes of biological degradation in order for the alien population carrying a foreign culture, alien to Europe and America, over the course of time, to replace the indigenous population. They have different traditions. The liberal market economic model is unacceptable for them. Even if it is acceptable to them, then their culture does not allow to ensure its scientific technological progress. Because when all these Toyotas in ISIS break down, and they run out of cartridges, they will have to return to camels, everything else. Because in order to produce Toyota, cartridges and machine guns, they need a different science, a different culture, a different system of education. This is not the case.
And then the same thing happens with us?
And the same thing happens with us. We are paying the price for the Judas sin of the 20th Congress. Because although Khrushchev lied from the rostrum without blushing, no one stopped this outrage.
This is when he accused Stalin.
Yes, when at the 20th Congress he lied from the rostrum with his report without blushing. Some of the Americans analyzed the report. Not a single thesis expressed there by Khrushchev is historically confirmed.
Then there were more people in the party than now. Now there are 450 deputies, while before there were 2,500 in the party.
Yes, there were a lot of people in the party, and no one took any measures to neutralize him. But this is only an indicator that psychodynamics is not correct. Because if there is no one at the 20th Congress, then, during the years of perestroika, Saji Umalatova and Bludov at the Supreme Council and at the Party Congress raised the question of investigating the activities of Mikhail Sergeyevich Gorbachev and his associates on the theme of treason. They spoke out openly. The Congress did not support this initiative, but at least someone appeared.
After the February Revolution, there was an officers' meeting in the same place where the officers' house is now. And what did they decide there? Well, they removed the king. Well, they removed and all the officers kept silent. There was one Kudasov. Walking along Litany, he gathered several soldiers, dispersed the crowd. That's all. All the other gentlemen officers were silent. And they took an oath to the emperor. So even then there was such a betrayal.
You see, if psychodynamics was formed over the course of several centuries on the principles of servitude domination, then such things are not liquidated by the decree of the institutions of Soviet power. These people must develop personally up to the point that the 1936 Constitution would be understandable to them. And they would really live according to it, not out of fear, not for payment, but out of service in life. Stalin did not have the time to bring the country to such a level of cultural development. In any crowd elite society, one's own skin right now, it is always somewhat more valuable than this very skin 10 years later. For example, in Germany in 1933, many happily voted so that later they and their children would die near Stalingrad. So that May the 9th, 1945 would take place exactly as it took place. The representative of the crowd in all societies, he lives according to the principle, my house is on the outskirts, we are small people, this does not concern us, this is Tsarist business, not our business, let them decide there. At the same time, there is one such feature, even if let them decide. After all, the rally is really not capable of governing the affairs of society when everyone decides. The correct rally, in the shortest possible time, elects the delegates, and they decide when the others work. But those empowered to govern in the right democracy can be called to account. Moreover, according to the Constitution of 1936, they could be called into account without waiting for the expiration of their term of office. And in this sense, that constitution is indeed the most democratic in the world. Another thing is that the party apparatus did not allow this constitutional provision to be procedurally formalized in the USSR at the level of functionally operable procedures, legal procedures that would guarantee the implementation of this constitutional principle and the safety of those who initiated the implementation of the recall of someone who has lost confidence. But now, in general, the parties live on the money of sponsors. The parties themselves decide what the list of candidates will be in the elections.
Sponsors tell them, let's say, advise them.
In general, the bulk of the population has nothing to do with this. There is no authority to revoke, to change the Constitution. The Constitution stipulates who can come up with such an initiative, but also not ordinary citizens of the country. Therefore, everything related to feedback lines from the current state, they are severed.
What if we return to the urban environment? It turns out that the city is sucking out the rural population from all sides. And it turns out that the city itself is not destroyed, but the hinterland is being destroyed. So is there a constant replenishment of the city?
Yes, it has been going on throughout history, and now in general we have come to the point that there is no one to suck out from the villages. When there is no one to suck out from the villages, migrants rush to the cities. In this sense, what is happening in Europe is a completely natural process.
The population used to be of better quality. It was trained. But migrants are idiots. It turns out that in cities, the population is getting worse.
Of course, especially since, as a rule, demoralized people who have not been able to realize themselves in their homeland, or who have been pressed there, these become migrants. Well, not the weakest die there, but those who had the strength to escape.
How then should we relate to these projects? When you look at the architectural projects of the future from any famous architects, these are always some kind of huge skyscrapers.
A huge skyscraper has the right to exist in one single case, if for 2 kilometers within a radius of it there is nothing but natural landscapes and the road that passes by it, in order that people can leave it where they need to for visiting or for work.
But all these ecological projects boil down to this: to put up a huge skyscraper, relatively speaking, in the middle of a field.
But if, again, to talk about how to live better, then by virtue of the fact that there is a biofield of the earth, and it is on a certain level, then it is better to live not in a huge skyscraper, with an artificial garden in a 3-level apartment, where on the first floor a fir tree grows, which on the third floor is decorated for New Year. But in general, a normal way of life outside the steppe zone, where nomadic nomads were initially normal, a normal way of life in the zone of forests and mountains, is a settlement built up with houses with farmstead buildings, when each family has its own plot, separated by a fence or, depending on how friendly we are with neighbors, a hedge. Children run as they want. Adults visit each other. If it's a holiday, then the whole street.
It turns out that a completely different system is being implemented.
A system is being introduced that minimizes a person's intrasocial connections to a minimum at work. Moreover, to a purely formal minimum, because business etiquette presupposes the elimination of sincerity from the work process. This is pure formalism. If we talk about what business games are, then these are attempts to develop automatisms of business communication, of behavior, that are not connected to the Nravi's ethical qualities of the participants.
It turns out that the process of building up cities is going on more and more. It is enough to see how Moscow and St. Petersburg are being built up. They grow, and the farther from the center, the higher the house is, and there is no end in sight. On the contrary, further and further.
To get out of this requires understanding and political will.
Now, while traveling, I see a lot more and more urban population, moreover not the first generation, are trying to build a house somewhere in the village. Many are already beginning to move. They gather intuitively into some kind of conglomerations. Here, what is this about? How can these conglomerations find their way in a new arrangement? And how to help in this? This trend is visible.
Here, state politics is needed. If the state lies under the central bank, and the central bank lies under the Federal Reserve System, and that, in turn, is supervised not by the smartest and not by the most dobriest people, to put it mildly, then another variant is impossible. Because, besides the fact that Europe is punished for the fact that they did not become Marxists, at the global level, one of the problems is the elimination of Russian civilization. There is only one way to prevent this: our own project of globalization, and its rigorous implementation in life. Well, in general, Khrushchyovkas wrote about this back in 1839 in the poem To Russia.
For example, a person realizes all this. He realizes that it is bad in the city. He feels it, he sees it. He wants to go somewhere. But there is no work, there is no kindergarten, there is no school. What to do?
This is what I'm saying, that this requires the corresponding politics of the state. It requires corresponding governance towards the economy of the state. It is not the state that serves business, but all business serves the state, and the state serves society. This is the correct interrelationship. But for this, society must generate statehood. And statehood should not be an isolated from society corporation, for which society is simply one of the resources on which the members of the corporation parasitize.
Well, what then to do now?
Well, the problem does not have quick solutions. Moreover, it does not have solutions by force.
Надо изменять культуру.
It is necessary to change the culture, purpose-orientedly.
Единственный надежный способ.
It takes a long time, but nonetheless, it is the only reliable way.
Кто-то посмотрит,
How to change?
кто-то напишет
So we will record a meeting, someone will watch, someone will write a comment on the theme that they are all idiots, someone will ponder on the theme that this problem really exists, despite the fact that they are all what they are and are less photogenic than they would like.
Cultural change is understandably a long-term, prolonged process. But at the level of state governance, can this be changed in the course of a few years?
On the condition that there are cadres who understand this problematics. The problematics is in the upbringing of cadres. Our system of education works on a textual, bookish basis. In principle, thanks to this, it reproduces biorobots, which do not comprehend anything and do not feel anything. They are governed by the flow of words in the OK Google style. There is no fundamental difference. Or the text is analogous to keyboard input. Further, there is only a question of the powers. If the text comes from the boss, how may I serve you? We will bend over backwards, we will make others bend over backwards, but we will do it. If the text comes from below, then the question is, who are you? Well, the question, who are you, in general, it is solved at the noospheric level, like the prophetic Alieg, who did not understand what the magus had indicated to him. And moreover, if he had perceived this as a basis for activity, that is, the minimum that he must do, and beyond which it will be counted as blago, then he relates to this in such a way that if it is not prescribed that he must do this, but he can do this, he will not do it. But you can't escape from this. This is a bureaucratic way of governance. And a bureaucrat is a certain psychology. This is a certain worldview from which the right hemisphere, which is responsible for images and processes, is excluded, and senses and intuition are excluded.
Moreover, I'm now getting another education in state municipal governance. Deputies and officials studied with me there. And for many, I saw the status, in the same Vkontakte, to make a career. They have no other interest. That is, their task is to climb higher on this bureaucratic ladder and be satisfied with this. And moreover, these are quite young people, and they are so openly positioning it, not to create a family, to give birth to children, something else, namely the desire for a career. But on the other hand, among young people in their 20s, I see an interest in the eyes and a search. With them, you just need to grope for the language that young people understand and provide more information. They absorb like a sponge.
In general, the school did not cripple everyone, and there are people who have retained their feelings and comprehension. There may not be very many of them, but they are. In relation to the future, the bulk of the statistical mass has never decided anything. The future has been determined either by the minority that pushed for development and worked for development, or by the minority that worked for degradation.
If you estimate it as a percentage, then I see a picture. In each student group, from 30%, sometimes up to half of these guys. And those who show more initiative, they're already less. That is, from this half, you can already take such guys as the support for the future. But here it should be from two sides. Because if a person, even with good intentions, gets into the state bureaucratic apparatus, he must do what he is prescribed from above. Otherwise, he just flies out of there.
There is another side of the question. A certain amount of understanding is also required there. This is one side of the question. The second side of the question consists in the fact that our standard education in the field of state and municipal governance, economics and finance, juridical education, does not provide the knowledge that would allow us to solve the problems of society in principle. And the main trouble is with this. Last year, the course State and Municipal Governance, a question. What are your claims against the state? Corruption. Guys, did you come to study in order to become certified corrupt officials? No. Further, the next question is, where does corruption come from? In order to solve the problems of society, you need to know a lot. And besides the fact that you need to know a lot of things you need to perceive with your senses. The way it is in life, regardless of what the TV shows and how subordinates write their reports. But in order to become a corrupt official, one thing is required. You cannot know all of this, but you need to know who can be shorn, who should not, to whom you need to bring his share, to be clearly defined in this is our mafia, this is the competing mafia. In a competing mafia, you can have your own agents, set them up in whatever way, and then these guys will be victims of the fight against corruption. And you need to keep an eye on your own mafia, not leave it hanging anywhere, because if you leave someone hanging somewhere, then you yourself become a victim to the fight against corruption, because the mafia does not tolerate those who do not observe corporate discipline. Well, and also victims of the fight against corruption are lone predators who don't understand that you need to know who can be shorn, who cannot be shorn, and to whom to bring his share in order for everything to be fine. But in order to solve problems, you need to know a lot and sense a lot. And if a standard education in the field of economics and finance, state and municipal governance, and juridical education does not provide such knowledge, then when a graduate from higher educational institution finds himself in the state apparatus, before him there is a choice. Either sit wearing out his pants, or join some mafia and be engaged in the abuse of power, one of the varieties of which is corruption. If you really want to eradicate corruption, then it is necessary in the system of higher education, oriented on the sphere of governance, that is, on state and municipal governance, and oriented on business governance, to provide adequate knowledge that allows one to solve problems. If the Ministry of Education and Science raises to the rank of knowledge that nonsense with which the textbooks on sociology, political science are full, then corruption is ineradicable.
Yeah, how far away it all is. We started with the way of life, even just living in the city, but it got to the point that we need to start with something completely different.
A way of life is a text with which a certain philosophy of life is written. Again, if returning to cities, many architects say, architecture is frozen music. If this is so, then frozen music is the Winter Palace, Palace Square, the Moscow Kremlin, and the neighborhoods built up with Khrushchyovkas. They are 24 hours a day.
That is, in essence, we need a state program for the development of sparsely populated or rural areas.
We need a state program for the transformation of Russia and the eradication of liberal market Moronism.